Grace and peace to you from God our Father, and from our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Amen. So let's be honest, that story from Genesis, disturbing. Is it not? And I'm not sure which is worse. Is it more disturbing that God asks Abraham to offer his son as a sacrifice to test him? Or is it more disturbing that Abraham seems to offer no complaint about it whatsoever? This is the same Abraham, by the way, who, in an episode that we passed over in the series that we've been following here, just a couple chapters earlier, argued with God on behalf of an entire city of people, hoping that God would spare it. But here, for his very own son, not a peep. What are we to make of this story? I mean, God seems like a tyrant. Abraham looks kind of like a mindless drone. And someone definitely needs to call Child Protective Services. All right, so the first thing we have to say is that, we're offered the story in Scripture, but it's kind of up to us to kind of figure out what it means. And so there aren't any for sure answers here. I'm going to throw out some ideas for how we might view this story in light of the world in which it happened and in light of what we know about who God is. To help us maybe make sense of this. For me, there are two underlying questions here that I've already kind of alluded to. And that is, what is Abraham doing? And what is God doing? So let's start with Abraham. In response to God's request that Abraham take his only son to Mount Moriah and offer him as a burnt offering, Abraham saddles his donkey, takes 2 young men, 2 servants, firewood, and Isaac, and goes. Now, there's a couple of details that I think are worth paying attention to in the story here. First of all, when they get within view of the place that God is leading Abraham to, Abraham tells the 2 young men, the servants, stay here with the donkey while the boy and I go over there and worship. And then he adds, and then we will come back to you. We? That's not how God laid out this event that's about to take place. Is Abraham being disingenuous? What's going on there? Why does he say we will come back? Or he just doesn't want to appear guilty or what? And then the second little thing to notice is that a short time later, he and Isaac are getting closer, and then there's this terrifying question for those of us hearing the story, where Isaac is like, hey, we've got the fire and we've got the wood. Where's the lamb for the burnt offering? Now, Abraham responds. He doesn't respond by saying what he has been told is going to happen. And he doesn't respond by simply saying, I don't know. Abraham responds by saying, no, don't worry. God will provide the lamb. Again, is he lying, or being disingenuous, or is he just making up a comforting story? Or could it possibly be that Abraham simply trusts God to such a degree that he is confident that a lamb will in fact be provided? That he and Isaac will indeed both return to those two men and the donkey. This would not be the first instance of Abraham offering an extreme amount of trust in God, right? It's one of the things I talked about in the very first episode that we had several weeks ago now, where God calls Abraham to leave his tribe, leave his family, and Abraham, despite the extreme dangers of being out in the wilderness, basically on your own, taking with him Sarah and some servants, but to leave the protection of the tribe. But in fact, Abraham just gets up and goes. So it's not the first time that Abraham might put some illogical trust in God. But this time it's a little different because God is the one saying, please go offer your son. It's not the promise of I will lead you to a new land. Now, you may still be thinking, yeah, but come on, Abraham doesn't even ask why God is making this demand. What's with that? Well, for me, it's helpful to remember here that, the Bible isn't just a book that dropped out of the sky, just as it is. Like, the Bible is a collection of the stories of God's people that have been collected in the midst of human history. Like real flesh, as we talked about last week, like real flesh and blood stories of people's experience of who God is and how they relate to God. Last week, well, not last week, but that very first week, I talked a little bit about, one of the reasons why it was so strange that Abraham followed was, and one of the things that was just distinctly unique about the story was that typically the gods don't speak to human beings, let alone make promises to them as God did to Abraham. In fact, usually it was the other way around. People would make promises, would make pledges to the gods so as to get from them good weather, healthy crops, healthy animals, successful births, all the things that are important to an ancient farming civilization. The people would make promises to the gods in the form of sacrifices. The thing about sacrifices, though, to gods who don't talk to you, with whom you cannot communicate, is that you're just guessing. Right? You're just hoping to appease them, to make them happy so that you will get the things that are important for your livelihood, like the good crops and the rainfall and the sunshine and everybody being healthy and so on and so forth, the victory over your enemies in war, like all of those things. And so if you can't communicate with the gods, then you just need to appease them with the offerings that you make to them. And you never know, and so if things go really well, or if things go really badly, like if the weather is amazing and you have a bumper crop, or if there's a drought and you have nothing, either way, no matter what happens, you probably need to offer more in your offerings than the year before. Because either the gods are angry at you and you need to appease them, or they've blessed you with an abundance and you need to respond accordingly. Right? There's never a case of, well, next year we'll offer less for our offerings to the gods. Like, that wouldn't make sense. So that's sort of the understanding that, and the relationship that human beings had with the supernatural, with the gods. That there was always the offer of these sacrifices. And so sometimes more and more and more would then lead to extreme sacrifices at the far end of the spectrum, where you might even offer your child. The Israelites were surrounded by other cultures that worshipped a variety of different gods. One of those gods was the god Moloch, that the Canaanites, some of the Canaanites worshipped. And Moloch, was a God to which child sacrifices were offered. In fact, there was a valley called Gehenna, which Jesus refers to in the Bible, which gets translated into our text as hell. But there was a valley in which was notorious for the followers of Moloch offering child sacrifices there for particular religious ceremonies. So it was a horrible way of being, that the promises that we offered as humans would take the form of sacrifices, sometimes extreme ones. Now, remember that Abraham was called at an old age to leave his family, to leave his tribe. But really, it wasn't about leaving the comforts of home. Really, it was leaving the old way of doing things. Right? That's what God is calling Abraham to leave behind. And one of those things that Abraham then is leaving behind is probably the offering of sacrifices, probably extreme sacrifices. So then, Abraham hears this request from God that he should offer his child. Abraham is now like 102 years old. Most of Abraham's life experience has been of gods that demand sacrifice. And so when this God demands an extreme sacrifice, it's not that strange. It's not that unusual. And so we might imagine that perhaps Abraham was like, well, that's what the gods do. They demand sacrifices. And so he heads off. Maybe he heads off with the hope. Maybe he even heads off with the trust that this God will find a different way. But he heads off just the same. Maybe Abraham proceeds because this comes as no surprise. So that brings us to our other big question. What is God doing here? The first thing I would say is that I believe that God is really interested in Abraham's response, interested in knowing what Abraham will do, especially if it's the case that, as we were just talking about, that Abraham has left a culture in which the gods demand sacrifices, right? If that's Abraham's first 75 years of life is being in that kind of culture, God has now called him out of that. This is like God saying, okay, so I am going to make a great nation of you. I am going to provide you with a land. And I am even going to bless the other families of the earth through your family and adopt you as my people. So I want to know, are you willing to go as far or even farther for me as you were for those false gods you left behind? So that's one piece. The other thing I would suggest is that perhaps God felt that Abraham needed this experience. Right? If Abraham's worldview is of divinity that demands sacrifice, and God has made these promises to Abraham, and Abraham has followed, but remember, like last week, we talked about Abraham and Sarah were taking some things into their own hands. They didn't really follow through on the trusting God thing. Maybe it is just entirely insufficient, grossly insufficient for God just to say, hey, Abraham, don't worry. Whatever comes up, I will provide. You know, God can say those words to Abraham, but sometimes we as human beings, like words aren't quite enough, right? Like sometimes we really need to experience a thing before the words sink in. So Abraham is asked to offer his son because now there's a life on the line, right? Now it's a life and death situation. God has asked that Abraham's son, Abraham's only son, Abraham's son that he and Sarah had waited an ungodly number of years to arrive, that they thought would never happen, that they laughed at when the idea was said, hey, you're going to have a child in your old age. Now that son is being asked of Abraham. And so now, when God steps in and provides a ram, it proves in a moment of Abraham's experience of who God is and what God does, it proves that God is a God who provides and not one who demands. I'll tell you what, I think we still need to hear that message often enough, right? I mean, raise your hand if you kind of feel like God is always like, we're always trying to live up to what God is asking of us. Right? Do you know anybody who won't walk into a church because they're afraid of being struck down by lightning? Right? Like that sense of like, the gods always want something from me. God always wants something from me that I have to live up, that I'm falling short. That's why Jesus came. So here is God stepping into this moment of human history, saying to Abraham, I will provide. It's an important word for all of us. And I would add, it's also important to hear that every child's life is sacred to God. And as we consider the ways in which the gods we still worship today, wealth, fame, pleasure, ideologies, like all of those gods that we still put our trust in today, when we should be putting our trust in God, those gods still demand sacrifices, even though we don't think of it that way. Our God says, put your trust in me, and I will provide. And that God, our God, is willing to act in love for us, even to come among us and stretch his arms out before us on a cross. I will provide. In Jesus' name. Amen.